The Trojan horse. The hollow horse left as a gift but secretly housing hundreds of invaders trying to breach the walls of Troy has become synonymous with hidden dangers, false gifts, secret invasions, and even computer viruses. But its tale of the Iliad also spoke to the dangers of hubris, the virtues of intellect, and the dangers of angering the gods. Whether or not the Trojan War was an actual event or just a tale dreamt up by Homer has divided the historical community. But one thing we all agree on is that if it did happen, it probably wasn't the classical Greeks who were responsible, but their Bronze Age ancestors, the Mycenaeans. So who were these Mycenaeans? What was their affiliation with mythology? What do we know about them? And what did their Greek descendants think of their Bronze Age ancestors? That is the focus of this video today.
Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
So, if you're here after my video on the Minoans, you'll know that the Aegean Bronze Age is my specialization and that the Mycenaeans eventually conquered the Minoans. And in this video we're going to focus on the Mycenaean culture. So, let's get right into it. The Mycenaeans emerged in the Peloponnese around 1700 BCE and expanded to become seafaring traders and warriors who controlled the Aegean. And these were a fascinating and easily identifiable people with very distinct burials, pottery, architecture, and symbology. So, first of all, the Mycenaeans are the first confirmed Greek culture in Greece. The script Linear B is basically Greek before the language adopted Phoenician characters. Now, I don't speak a lot of Greek, but my Greek colleagues assure me that they can understand the language, and I'm going to take their word for it. And there are a lot of Mycenaean records. We have hundreds of them preserved from Mycenae, Knossos, Pylos, and Tiryns, chief among them, although there are other scripts from other sites too, both from clay tablets and artifacts. So this is fantastic, right? I should be able to say an awful lot about them. Well, actually, no. See, despite the fact we can read these scripts, and there are a lot of them, there's not actually much to read. It turns out all these records seem to be supply rosters or receipts, a list of goods, and how they were distributed. We don't know if this was a list of paid debts or debts to be paid, or if it was taxes, or if it was intercity trade. We don't even have a date on them. Place names are few and far between, and no individual is mentioned. You can imagine how disappointed we were at this determined lack of information once we cracked the language. It gives us a good economic picture, which, don't get me wrong, has its uses, but it isn't terribly useful for anything else. And again, it's not that the information isn't useful. A good economic picture is nothing to sneeze at. We can get a picture of their social stratification, so we can see that they had crafters and a priesthood which were open to both genders. They had royalty, soldiers, conscripted labor, and slave labor. Literacy was very limited as the handwriting between individual scribes differs very little. They specialized in manufactured goods, especially bronze, pottery, and textiles. We also see the classical Greek gods mentioned in offering tablets, including all 12 Olympians, along with a couple of other gods that we would not have been familiar with in later eras. Mycenaeans are named after the town of Mycenae, which is typically seen as the center of Mycenaean culture. However, calling it a capital has been disregarded by experts. It is the largest Mycenaean city we know of, however, most of us believe that, like their later Greek descendants, they were actually made up of a group of independent city-states forming alliances based on a shared culture and worldview. Tiryns actually seems to be older than Mycenae, but Mycenae was also where the culture was first identified. The site was first excavated by Heinrich Schliemann, a German archaeologist who conducted the first excavations at Mycenae in 1874. Now, Schliemann is one of the archaeological pioneers, and he was a trailblazer in proper scientific archaeology at a time when most of the rest of Europe was just looting their colonies. That being said, he also did have some very controversial and destructive methods, and infamously excavated much of Mycenae with dynamite. He also had an obsession with the Homeric epics and sought to dig at sites which were significant to these stories. It should come as no surprise, then, that Schliemann dug at what we consider to be Troy. Due to his shared excavations in both these sites, he seemed determined to link the Trojans and the Mycenaeans with the Iliad. His argument for Troy is fairly solid, actually, and the timelines certainly match, however the locations are a bit dubious. If anyone fought the Trojans, it would have been the Mycenaeans, and the city we call Troy has a destruction layer that matches with the end of the Mycenaean era. However, if this city is Troy, it's never been confirmed. Don't get me wrong, it's generally accepted to be the best candidate for Troy, just be aware that there is no conclusive evidence linking it to Troy. And Schliemann's obsession with the classics means that he was determined to see a link be made. As such, he attempted to tie Mycenae in with Homeric epics too. Let's look at a couple of examples. This is the Mask of Agamemnon. Now, linking the Iliad's Agamemnon to Mycenae, unlike the links to Troy, are dubious at best, and even if this was the case, this could not have been Agamemnon's mask. For one thing, it's too old. It's at least 200 years older than the destruction layers at Troy, if not even older. Likewise, the tomb of Atreus is far too old to be associated with the Iliad. Just because it has a classical or biblical name doesn't mean it's necessarily linked to that figure, especially from the days of the 19th century when there was an obsession among academics to find links with a mythical or biblical link. The very impressive palace at Pylos, for example, is also often associated with the Iliad's Nestor, but again, there's no solid evidence to make this link, but unlike some links at Mycenae, this does at least have an argument behind it. And although these mythical associations can be called into question, the rest of the research done here is solid and evidence-based, and to be honest, if you're coming here after watching my Minoan video, that's probably the question you have in mind, given the way Evans really screwed over Knossos. Well, rest easy. Thankfully, Evans was an exception and not a rule, even for his time, and the excavations of Mycenae are fairly trustworthy. Now, there are some questions as to Schliemann's reputation, and he does have a history of lying and faking some records. However, based on other Mycenaean cities and some further research, it seems his greatest crime was being too obsessed with Homer. Ultimately, he got a lot of dates and mythical associations wrong, and he was not careful with locations, but there doesn't seem to be any downright fakery, and thankfully these other errors can be corrected by modern archaeologists. In short, Schliemann's work may not be trustworthy, but the modern archaeology is, and his mistakes have been mostly corrected even in the public eye. He didn't do anywhere near as much damage as Arthur Evans did with Knossos. Everything you see here is still going to be an artifact, not an artifiction. And all this proves that their elites were the equivalent of kings, and those kings were buried in these massive chamber tombs. Chamber tombs are unique in archaeology, and they signify that this is a Mycenaean area. Or at least Mycenaean controlled. Because the Mycenaeans didn't get large and rich by staying in the Peloponnese, so no. They had a huge colonial network across the Aegean with evidence linking them in Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant, with possible evidence linking them to the Sea Peoples. Sometime during the 15th century BCE, the Mycenaeans expanded to take over the Minoan lands and the old Minoan trade networks and entered their own golden age. The Mycenaeans, whether through warfare or economic submission or political unity, absorbed and replaced these old Minoan networks and expanded them. The Mycenaeans became traders of goods from Italy through to Mesopotamia and Troy. The Mycenaeans are also said to have been far more warlike and violent than their Minoan predecessors. However, this is based on the somewhat romantic ideal peddled by Arthur Evans, which again, referring to the Minoan video, we know he was a bit of a problem. And far from seeing evidence of a violent conquest, in fact what we seem to see is Mycenaean culture blending with their Minoan counterparts, and coming into Minoan lands through a slow creep rather than through a conquest. Mycenaean culture is also clearly inspired by the Minoans. Take a look at these examples. We can see a definite difference, but there is also an undeniable similarity. The Mycenaeans likewise arose around 1700 BCE during the Minoan Golden Age. It's obvious that these emerging people would have been heavily influenced by the Minoan super-empire right on their doorstep. Minoan sites show few signs of widespread unnatural destruction. However, it is certain that they were absorbed into Mycenaean culture. We see a complete abandonment of all Minoan styles of art and architecture by 1400 BCE replaced with Mycenaean styles, and even their language seems to have been replaced with Knossos itself, yielding one of the largest hordes of Linear B inscriptions. The Minoan language of Linear A, meanwhile, is still in use as a script, but at this point it's only a transliteration of Mycenaean Greek rather than as an expression of the Minoan language. There is also no denying that the Mycenaeans seem to have a much larger flair for warfare than the Minoans. Minoans had no fortifications on their buildings, but Mycenaeans did. The ancient Greeks referred to these walls as Cyclopean because they thought only a cyclops could have moved the stones required to build them. And these are indeed far thicker and larger stones than classical Greek cities would be used to, and everywhere is evidence of a violent world. Half of all Linear B tablets refer to rowers, armor, and weapons being sent to the coast, and speak of rosters that would seem to equip an army. They also had a well-established rivalry with the Hittites, who barred Mycenaean imports and likely controlled the port of Troy, or at least had a strong alliance with it. It's more than possible that this rivalry turned violent, especially with these two lands being so close together. Intercity warfare was a familiar sight during the age of the classical Greeks, so it wouldn't be a surprise if the Mycenaeans also engaged in it too, and indeed there is evidence for that. But why did these fortifications shrink if this is the case? Well, there are a few reasons, the most obvious of which being that warfare just changed. Perhaps these walls were no longer needed, maybe newer cities did more with less resources, maybe armies just shrunk as war became almost a sport. There are dozens of explanations, and, like the chamber tombs, these sorts of walls are clear indicators of sustained, long-term Mycenaean presence. Finally, one of the unique Mycenaean indicators is their pottery. And, like the very easily recognized red-on-black Greek pottery, Mycenaean pottery is also strikingly unique. I can pick up a potsherd from the ground and know immediately it is Mycenaean. Look at some of these examples. This is probably the best indicator of Mycenaean presence, however not all presence will be of colonies or settlements. Mycenaean ceramics were so beautiful in the ancient world that it became what they were known for. Oftentimes Mycenaean traders would have sold their ceramics for various other goods, and some goods would have been delivered in these ceramics. As a result, the spread of Mycenaean pottery far outpaces the spread of the Mycenaeans themselves, and instances of it can be found all over the eastern Mediterranean. In short, these are a very identifiable people who left a pretty obvious mark wherever they went and wherever they had a presence. And yet, by the 12th century BCE, they were disappearing. So, what happened to them? Well, here we get into some pretty fun archaeology, and to be honest, a pretty heated debate. So, let's get into the fun stuff. Firstly, the disappearance of culture does not indicate disappearance of people. What happened to the Mycenaeans? Well, in a sense, it's the same thing that happened to our ancestors in the 19th century. New generations came up with new traditions and ideas and found new ways of expressing them. And indeed, we see a transition in some key areas of Mycenaean heartlands. On Rhodes, we see Mycenaean pottery continue well after the Mycenaeans left the island, with an evolution of their pottery styles, and we see geometric-era Greek pottery mirroring it pretty closely too. More than that, many Mycenaean cities simply can't be examined because the classical Greek cities are built over top of them. We know that there are Mycenaean cities at Sparta, Thebes, Argos, and even Athens, but do you really want us to tear down the Parthenon to get at it? Of course you don't. Archaeologists don't really want to tear down the Parthenon to get at it either. But even if there was no true extinction, that doesn't mean there wasn't something happening. Mycenaean lands suddenly experienced a huge depopulation. Their cities are abandoned or they shrank, and their people disappeared, and we see destruction layers in the archaeological record all dating to around the same half-century. The same half-century, incidentally, as the Trojan War is supposed to have taken place. This was part of a wider Eastern Mediterranean phenomenon known as the Bronze Age collapse, which saw not just the disappearance of the Mycenaeans, but also the collapse of the Hittites and the Mesopotamian empires, along with the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom. Now, we don't really know what caused this. I've seen theories among enthusiasts try to blame the Sea Peoples. Sea Peoples were a group of very strong pirates who began ravaging around the region at this time. But while this is a theory, it is a fairly weak one if I'm honest, and most professionals believe there was something deeper. Most of us think that Sea Peoples were more likely to be a symptom of the problem rather than the cause of it. But it is a popular theory because we don't know who the Sea Peoples were or where they came from. There are other wild theories which I've put up on the screen for the Bronze Age collapse, but honestly we simply do not know the truth. At any rate, this did usher in the Dark Ages. Different Dark Ages. And this doesn't mean the times were explicitly poor, it just means that we run out of any real evidence to piece together a narrative. The history of Greece from the end of the Mycenaeans through to the 8th century BCE is mostly a blank save for one or two exceptions. Greeks of the classical era claim there was a migration of Dorians from the north, explaining the Doric and Ionic differences. However, again, there is no evidence for this, and the closer we look at archaeology, the more likely it seems they were descended from Mycenaeans themselves. There is, of course, a theory that the Sea Peoples were Mycenaeans, and there's reasons to that, which I will probably get into in another video because the Sea Peoples are a whole topic unto themselves, but here's a brief rundown of the theory just on the screen now. The Greeks never totally forgot the Mycenaeans either. Ever the poet, Homer wrote that the gods began a war between the Greeks and the Trojans to rid the world of demigods and ended the era of divine involvement in humanity. And just as in Homer's Iliad, the Trojan War took place at the sunset of the Mycenaean era, just before the centuries-long Dark Age. These were the Greeks of the heroic age, the era of Perseus and Medusa, of Heracles, of Theseus, and of Jason's Argonauts. It was the era of war between titans and gods, an age of monsters and mythology. Although they may have been mythologized and altered to fit a world the classical Greeks would better understand, it can be fascinating to think that these figures may have once had a basis in fact, ruling the Eastern Mediterranean and laying the foundations of our own Western ideologies. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel. The link to my Patreon is in the description, and until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.